Welcome. It's so great to see so many people here today. Thanks for joining us. We have almost 350 people signed up today. So at least that many people will be watching the recording. Welcome, everyone. My name is Juniper Franklin. I'm the program director of the Hudson Valley Writer Center. And I am joined, as always, by my right-hand woman and Hunter MFA student, the wonderful Sophia Bannister. Sophia and I are so happy to have you with us today for one of a small handful of launch events for modern poetry by Diane Seuss. Diane is joined for a reading and conversation with one of her former students, the very talented Jane Huffman, whose debut public abstract won the prestigious APR Honickman Award in 2023 that was chosen by Dana Levin. If this is your first time joining us for a reading, welcome. We hope you continue to come to our online readings, classes, and events. Please check out our website for the complete list of offerings. We hope all of you will return to the Hudson Valley Writer Center for our next Zoom reading, and in person, the people who live nearby, as we welcome Michael Klein, John Hoppenthaler, Janine Joseph, and Brian Turner on Sunday, March 24th at 4 p.m. There's also a special masterclass with Brian Turner at 1:30 for folks in our region. Today, I want to thank the board of directors, our teachers, and our students who are the beating heart of the center and the whole reason we exist. We want to thank the foundations and organizations who support us, including the Bidell Foundation, the David G. Taft Foundation, NISCA, and Arts Westchester. I also want to thank my colleagues, Misty Yarnell, Christina Papadopoulos, and Sophia Bannister for all their hard work. And of course, a warm thanks to Jane and Di, who are here today to spend time with us on this Sunday afternoon. Jane Huffman's debut poetry collection, Public Abstract, was the winner of the 2023 APR Honickman First Book Prize, selected by Dana Levin. Her poems have been published in The New Yorker, Poetry Magazine, The Nation, and many other journals. She was the recipient of a 2019 Ruth, Lily, and Dorothy Sargent Rosenberg Fellowship from the Poetry Foundation, and she's also the recipient of a fellowship from Adroit. She has an MFA from the Iowa Writers Workshop and is a PhD student in creative writing at the University of Denver. She is the founder and editor-in-chief of the online literary journal Guest House, and she self-describes as, quote, a poet and scholar interested in the theologies and possibilities of form, the ritualistic present, obsession, embodiment, and philosophies of illness. Her intricate debut collection, Public Abstract, examines illness and recovery, loss and addiction, the ripples of influence an addict has on their family circle, and vice versa. She says, in Rest, from one lung I tell the truth, from the other lung I lie. Form becomes an act of invention, and in Huffman's expert hands, revision becomes a genre. And as Diane Seuss says about Jane's work in the New Yorker podcast, quote, one thing that really interests me in Jane's poetry, and in Ode in particular, is how there is this interchange between what's happening in the form and music, and then what's happening in the form and plot itself. Please, everyone, help me welcome Jane Huffman.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Jennifer. That bio was beautiful. I really appreciate it. And thank you so much for having me. And hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay, great. Thank you so much for being here this afternoon. I'm going to read from Public Abstract, which I've got here. Okay, this first poem is called Public Abstract. I swept and am sweeping. have slept and am sleeping. I heaved the head of the mop to the hod, and I'm heaving. I'm sweating. I'm wetting the corn of my broom. I'm washing the floor in the room where I waited for reason. I reasoned. I teased at the edges of reason. Okay, this one's called The Rest. Jennifer quoted briefly from it in the intro. The Rest. Still, I keep myself. I take to bed. One lung is red. Cut red flowers hung in pink water. My other lung is out of line. From one lung, I tell the truth. From the other lung, I lie. Cut pink flowers hung in red water. Like a pain, the truth is mine. The lie is that today I want to die. Cut red water hung in pink flowers. The rest of it is stillness, rest, a soft cough into a hard pan, a hard cough into a soft plain. Cut pink water hung in red flowers. I was reticent in childhood. I was reticent in childhood, prepared for nothing, testing fragrant waters at the toilet water counter, diagramming sentences. I ran the empty aisles of Mercy's auditorium, annexed out of mine own little annex, made a little art of panicking. Okay, this one's called There Was a Clearance. There was a clearance in my health, a sudden voice. The long arm of the mind reached toward me with a choice. She said, I made arrangements. Get up from your bed. She held a washcloth to the swollen belly of my head. Whether she was life or death, I couldn't tell. My health, a dispossession, like a sail. I wasn't ill and indecision, but I wasn't well. All right, here's another respiratory poem. I've got a lot of those. This is called I Had a Bout. A bout, a space bout. I had a bout. I had a bout of something undefined, another rattle in the lung, as if I stood under the ladder of my childhood for years before I climbed a single rung. I had a bout of vertigo inside my chest, a clocking from within, was bested by the worst of me again, as if my body shook off all its walls and doors and reeled the outside in. I had a bout of something, like a flame, a burning in the core, like shame, an ache the size and color of a thought, a boutness, like a cough I cannot shake. Okay, here's a longer piece called Three Odes. 1. I asked my brother Death about his journey to the center of the world, where he lost his life in winter, but bought it back in spring, with money that he siphoned from our mother's wedding ring. He said, my sister, Death is not as cunning as you think. He brought me to his little well of ink whenever I asked, and let me drink a little from his flask of life, and pleaded with me when I left. He begged me not to leave. And so I sat with Death beneath our mother's dogwood tree, my brother and his death on either side of me. 2. I've mourned my living brother many years. This is the heavy table of my work. I lug the heavy table of my work around all day, so I am never rid of it. I am never rid of it, the work that carries me like I'm a tired child sleeping in its arms. I sleep in my brother's arms. It takes all his strength to carry me. With all my strength, I lug my brother up the hill where we as children buried pill bugs in finger holes. My brother buried pill bugs in the ground. I dug them up. I dig my brother's body from the ground, from beneath the heavy table of the earth. He lugs the heavy table of the earth, the maple tree that grows out of his head. The maple tree that grows out of his head is heavy with the longing of the dead. My brother's death is long and heavy as a year. I've mourned my living brother all my life. 3. I don't know my brother as a man, a force of nature, rather, like the wind that brushes up against the house because it must. He makes demands. He carries with him fallen leaves and mites and owl pellets, ridden with the shattered bones of mice, because he must. I didn't know my brother as a boy. Burgeoning, we parted into different woods. He to using his own shadow like a mattress on the floor, where he could pull his body from his mind like pulling corn silk off the husk. And I to using sadness like a broom to sweep my shadow up. Okay, here's a small one, a little lighter perhaps. This is called Coda. Form implies the opposite of form, a globule, a formlessness, a letting go. Like fear implies the opposite of fear, relief, approximation of the human form built in packing snow. And yet the opposite of form, relief from form, implies the opposite relief from formlessness. Packing snow made globular when thrown is blown back to the ether of the whole, like grief. Okay. I'm gonna just read a couple more. The last section in the book is a series of haibun, which look a bit like this. Prose section followed by a modified haiku. This one's called On Moving. Like butter gone, I'm moving on because it would be ludicrous to stay. It feels like a return to sanity, although I've never been. I've never lived a mile west of Illinois. I come home from the soaring, Rilke writes, which I take as imperative, omit the I, to ground, return to earth, to grind the fable of my life down like orpiment into a yellow ash and tie my body to the floor. Rilke writes of God still roaring in my ears, but God for me today is fear. Goodbye to my deteriorating house. Delirium, I'm out the door. Stasis is a sieve through which I drag myself. Literature feels far away. Black bulls grazing beyond a pale hill. Okay, this one's called On Knowing. What I didn't know grew over what I knew. Like sober news from home, it sobered me. It touched down like a flea of doubt touched down on me and bit. So suddenly, like tardy students at the door, a little sadness on their faces as they make their plea. My grace, a sham, a fraying pillowcase. Helicopter seeds. Annunciation amid Iowa weather. Okay, and this is the last one I'll read, and thank you all so much for your attention. This is called On Influence. I'm under it, addicted to the family disease. My obsessions weigh on me. It's loud, the membrane language of the brain, but plain, like spoken language overheard, like laudanum and anchovies to clean the nerve, to ease the rash, to being good, this paragraph. If I could think a single thought that didn't burn itself to ash, I would. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jane. That was such a wonderful reading of your work. You're such a good reader as well as such a good poet. And your use of form is so impressive and really stunning. Thank you for being here today and for sharing your work with us. Diane Seuss needs no introduction, but Sophia will put her detailed bio in the chat anyway. As you know, Diane is the author of 6 astonishing books of poetry, most recently, the brand new Modern Poetry, which was just published by Graywolf Press on March 6, 2024, and Frank Sonnets, also by Graywolf, winner of the 2022 Voelcker Award and the 2021 Los Angeles Times Book Award and the 21 National Book Critics Circle Award and the 2022 Pulitzer Prize. She's been a Guggenheim Fellow and was writer in residence at Kalamazoo College for many years. In January 2024, she was elected as Chancellor of the Academy of American Poets. And as she always loves to say in her bio, she was raised by a single mother in rural Michigan, which she still continues to call home. Seuss's modern poetry investigates our time's deep isolation and divisiveness and asks, what can poetry be now? Do poems still have the capacity to mean? In the second poem in the book, Seuss writes, "It seems wrong to curl now within the confines of a poem. You can't hide from what you made inside what you made." Through deep investigation of self, poetry, craft, and what it means to be a self in and apart from the world, Seuss discovers through the act of writing this collection the deep and abiding meaning that reading and writing poetry has offered her and continues to offer her. The conviction and confidence of Diane Seuss's voice has the conviction and confidence of all the great dead poets I loved as a young student. I cannot list all of the things I admire about her work today, but I will tell you my favorite. Di's voice is so unique and so unabashedly her own. It never fails to move me and often makes me cry. Please, everyone, help me welcome the amazing, the one and only Diane Seuss.
Thank you so much. God, that's so beautiful. But I expect nothing less from you because you are the consummate beautiful soul. I thank you, Jennifer, divine Jennifer, and the Hudson Valley Writers Center, and of course, and Sophia, who is assisting today, and of course, Jane Huffman, who I got to teach for a while, teaches in quotes. Whether I taught her anything remains to be seen. I think she pretty much had it without me. And especially I want to thank those who have read my work and supported me as a writer, and to those listeners who took the time to be here today. All right, enough of that. So I'm going to read a few poems from modern poetry, and then Jane and I are going to royally shoot the shit. I'll start here because Jane had a poem with the same title. It's called Coda. The best poem is no poem. In a swath of poems or a swathe of poems, the best poem is without genealogy, or fragrance. It's like an animal born without a voice box, or its inconvenient voice box has been removed. The best body, nobody says to no one, is nobody. The best body, no body at all. The sound a bodiless body makes is akin to the sound a bird makes when it dips its beak into a cup of jam. Sometimes a bone makes a sound when it breaks. It sounds just as you'd imagine it would sound. Other times the bone is as quiet as a really good burglar breaking and entering. There used to be a prairie that extended way past the ending of every story, an expanse of sedges and grasses and wind, which made a sound like a sprinkler when the water has been turned off for the non-payment of the bill. The what? The bill, the unpaid water bill. Out of the spigot streams a thirsty non-compliance, an anti-song. So one of the things Jane and I might be able to squeeze in are talking about the work of smaller poems like Coda and the work of longer poems. And when in Frank's sonnets, of course, all the poems in that book were a mere 14 lines. And because I like to shake it up, I resolved to try longer poems. And making that commitment meant I had to sort of sustain and think through larger units of thought and even rhetorical thinking. And so I think I'll read one of those poems. And this is a poem called Love Letter. And it's thinking through the question of love. But what can it be if love is a past tense event? And what was love then, according to my brain? And what is love now? And how do I direct it like a beam with the power to excise all that is not love? For a time, I believed getting and keeping love required lace, procuring lace and arranging it on my body in a certain way. Isn't that funny and or strange? I modulated my voice to the northern region of its register, reddened my lips. This was love's drapery and music and face. If you've read Madame Bovary, if you've read Gothic romance, you know the denouement of that arc. When I first read the word denouement out loud, my ex-husband laughed at my mispronunciation. I include it here as an illustration of the fact that love does not conquer all. Now, when I think of love, it's like focusing too hard on the mechanisms of blinking or breathing. You can be blinded or suffocated by that degree of self-consciousness. Like a love letter, love seems to me to exist on a thin plane, a disintegrating page covered in words scratched onto the surface with purple, disappearing ink, cooked up in a chemistry lab. I'm sure I've written a love letter here and there, something gauche, a performance designed toward the specific outcome of eternity. I read of a feral dog who could only be captured by putting the soiled blankets of her puppies in a live trap. This is my metaphor for a love letter. I own a letter my father wrote my mother when they were newly in love. The stationery is smallish and decorated with a garish deep red rose in aching bloom. He spends most of his language's currency bemoaning his bad spelling. No wonder she found him charming. For my people, it is the flaw that counts, but not for all people. Our narrative is an object lesson in the fact that flawed people deserve to be loved, at least for a while. That's the ephemeral part. I'm much too sturdy now to invest in the ephemeral. No, I do not own lace curtains. It's clear we die 100 times before we die. The selves that were gauzy, soft, sweet, capable of throwing themselves away on love died young. They sacrificed themselves to the long haul. Picture girls in white nighties jumping off a cliff into the sea. I want to say, don't mistake this for cynicism, but of course it is cynicism. Cynicism is a go-to. I no longer have the energy to resist. It's like living with a vampire. Finally, just get it over with, bite me. I find it almost offensive to use the word love in relation to people I actually love. The word has jumped off so many cliffs into so many seas. What can it now signify? Shall I use the word affinity, like J.D. Salinger, not a good man, put into the mouths of his child genius characters? I have an affinity for my parents, an affinity for you. I will make sure you are fed and clothed. I will listen to you endlessly. I will protect your privacy, even if it means removing myself from the equation. Do those sound like wedding vows? Are they indiscriminate? Well, then I am indiscriminate. I am married to the world. I have worked it all out in front of you. Isn't that a kind of nakedness? You have called for a love letter. This is a love letter. I'll just read one more, and I want to dedicate this to Juniper because she too loves John Keats, but don't we all? It's called Romantic Poetry. Now that the TV is gone and the music has been hauled away, it's just me here and the muffling silence a spider wraps around a living morsel. And at times, often the unbearable. I bear it, though, just like you. Long ago, I bore a suitcase filled with books, bore it far on city streets, to sell, I guess, at some used books place, one of those doorways down steps into dankness and darkness. The scent of mildewed, dog-eared, fingered pages. The suitcase, big and square and sharp-cornered, covered in snake skin, bought at Goodwill for $1, knowing I had some traveling to do, some lugging, and I was right. What books I sold, I do not know. Maybe that's where modern poetry went. The cover cherry red and blossom white. I can see its spine in my mind's eye, pointing downward, beneath the dank and the dark, to the water tunneling under the city and making its way to the river. poems sliding down the book spine into water, the shock of the cold and dank, down where my uterine lining, my blood and cast off ovulations, cast off fetal tissue swims below the city. The micro dead ride modern poems like swan boats in the park, from the park to the river to the sea. I'm thinking now of P.J. Harvey and Nick Cave, balladeers, lovers, Vida and Virginia, Frank O'Hara and Vincent Warren. Somehow we ride our lost loves out to sea, or they ride us. It doesn't matter. Poet or poem or reader, the same ectoplasm. The modern in time becomes antique, and the stone faces of the dead convert to symbols ripe for smashing. Come to think of it, symbols are terrible. As the tyrant shouted to the masses, part of his brainwashing campaign, I know it and you know it too. I was 23 when I sold off modern poetry and sailed to Italy, seeking romantic poetry, which was at one time modern, and found my way to Rome and Keats' death room. His deathbed, a facsimile. Everything he touched was burned to kill what killed him. I lifted his death mask from its nail, cradled it, closed my eyes and kissed his lips until the plaster warmed and stained his face with the lipstick on my lips. Red as the cover of modern poetry. The color of the droplets of arterial blood he coughed onto his sheets and viewed by candlelight. Then he knew he was done for. His death warrant, he called it. After those many kisses over his face and eyes and the reticulated eyelashes, cold and tangled, my lips were blossom white, my face chalked, like I'd caught something from him. And I don't just mean consumption, though my lungs burned for years. They still burn. This is the danger of the ecstasy of kissing the dead or dying poet on the mouth. The disease you'll catch, well, it changes you. The tingle in the spine, the erotic charge will be forever married to poetry's previous incarnations. It's why marriage itself never worked for me. I kept wanting to get to the part where death parts us and I could find myself again. Keats made a compact corpse, only 5 feet tall, shorter than Prince, and intricately made. Always he was working it out, the meaning of suffering, the world, his own, the encounter with beauty, nearly synonymous with suffering, how empathy could extinguish him, and he could set down the suitcase at last, or finally deliver him to himself, distinct as the waves in his hair and the bridge of his nose. How auspicious, rare, lush, bizarre, kinky, transcendent, romantic to be young, just 23, and to cradle him in my arms as we listen to the burbling water of the Fontana della Barcaccia from the open window. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Diane.
Yeah,
That's it. All right.
that's it.
That's it.
Close the book on that one, baby.
That is it.
Mm.
Thank you both. It's so exciting to have you here to read your poetry and to be in conversation first with each other and then with us. So please, all of you, write your questions in the chat, and Sophia and I will ask. Maybe just to start us off, I have one question about something that you both seem to really do in your poetry. Eliot says the emotion of art is impersonal, and the poet cannot reach this impersonality without surrendering himself wholly to the work to be done. And he is not likely to know what is to be done unless he lives in what is not merely the present, but the present moment of the past, unless he is conscious not of what is dead, but what is already living. And it seems that both of you have this kind of distancing approach to the subject, to the I in the poem, and the way both of you seem to approach writing about personal things in your life. Would you like to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Jane, are you unmuted there? God, thank you. I'm still like, unmute, Jane, unmute.
I'm unmuted.
I want you to start.
Sure. Yeah, I think it's a beautiful question. And I think a lot about distance in my work. Because my work tends to be pretty language driven. Usually a poem doesn't start for me so much with a concept or an idea, that it starts with language. And so I think there's sort of inherent in that method is a little bit of distance. Where, seldom do I sit down and say, okay, I'm going to explore this topic in a poem. It's more so a little fragment of speech or language sort of gets stuck in my ear. And so I think by following the language, I'm able to capture, I hope, sort of a emotional landscape or feeling that sometimes betrays sense and sometimes betrays narrative. But I think I'm more interested in that affect in a poem than I am in like particular narrative details, if that makes sense. I think that sonically, like each poem has a sonic life beyond its content. And that sonic life is what I'm kind of trying to always manipulate. And I hope that through that method, something about my mind, my subjectivity, my private idiom, the way that my brain works translates to the page. Like that to me is what is most interesting about poetry. So yeah, I think I'm more interested in capturing that kind of essential private mode of thinking than I am in capturing something ultimately true or narrative. So yeah, that I think that distance for me, I like to put distance between language and narrative.
Mm. Do the rhymes and the metrical movement of the poems provide you with that distance, or do they betray whatever is the opposite of distance? What is?
I mean, I
Intimacy?
think that the rhyme is sort of intimate.
Mm-hmm.
There's something about rhyme in poetry that gives the sense of completeness, of wholeness. And I think that because I am working sometimes in modes of, I resist the word nonsense, but I think it can be a useful term. That sometimes even if like there isn't a narrative completeness, the rhyme offers the semblance of a completeness.
Mm-hmm.
It offers a shape, in the same way that other formal components of poetry do. So to me, there's intimacy in rhyme. It feels vulnerable to me.
Yeah,
And
because you can make a really dumb one like Moon and Spoon,
so-
like your whole, all
right.
the bullshit is exposed.
Absolutely. Yeah. It is kind of like a laying it out on the table.
Mhm.
It's kind of a, I don't know. I find rhyme to be quite intimate.
Mhm.
So I think that like conceptually, I think that there's a lot of whatever the opposite of distance is, intimacy or closeness in that sonnet play. Because it's like as I think as close as to my like emotional self as I can get, if that makes sense.
It does. I guess I'm thinking about the connection between childhood crap, trauma, whatever, and the wish for this sort of closure and completeness and boundary even of the way you make poems.
Mhm. Yeah, I think there's a tendency in me to want to shore things up, to make things tidy, to put things in shapes and forms, which is I think why form has always been so important to me. And Di, you were the person who opened that door for me when you were my teacher. Um, and so I think that form offers a kind of relief for me,
Mhm,
a way of taking something that feels unmanageable, like anxiety, and putting it into a shape that's a little bit easier to hold.
mhm,
And I'm interested in how poetry can enact that tension between what's holdable and not holdable.
mhm,
Yeah. Yeah. Great. Thank you for asking. That's a great
mhm.
question.
Yeah. Um, in this book in particular, my version of objectivity in this book is I'm talking about objectivity. That is, I'm writing, many of these poems, as you saw today. I took the risk of reading some of the longer ones because I had faith in this audience, but um, and also because Jane and I want to talk about short and long, or Mutton Jeff, as we like to call it. Um, but even when, for instance, there's another poem after the one I read about Keats, where Keats is post-death and looking in on Fanny Braun, the love of his life, and realizing that his feelings about her, what he sees in her, is a kind, he's now seeing her with objectivity. Um, and I mean, even when I read that out loud, it really gets me in the chest, um, that there is something to achieve. And maybe in a way, it's like enlightenment or whatever the hell, um, in which we're past the sort of personal, the personal and entrenched nature of romantic love, and in which for me it was always entrenched, and that the bigger love has a degree of objectivity that isn't as comforting in the moment, but for me has ended up feeling comforting in a larger sense, I guess. But I'm still abouting it. I'm still sort of describing it. And I think in this case, I really want to bring you with me. I want to bring the reader with me. And that requires, like when you're writing an essay, you're trying to sort of bring the reader with you through a train of thought to move from one state of being into another. And so that's a big reason that I dedicated this book to my reader, because I needed to know that you were there as I went through this very difficult process of bringing um, my deepest doubts to the page. So I don't know if that addresses it, but I started being interested in coldness, in emotional coldness in my book, Four-Legged Girl, in which I could see a gap between the sort of confessional, the entrenchment of confessionalism, to something where I could speak of and to the past, or of the intensity of an experience through a veil of objectivity. There's a poem in Four-Legged Girl called Long, Long Ago, I Used to Smoke in Bed. And that poem really looks at sort of the character of the speaker as being a character that valued a degree of coldness. That coldness was connected to her freedom. So maybe it's one of the things that I've been exploring for a good part of my writing life. In this book, for instance, I'd written a lot of my father as a not sort of my personal story of losing my father young, but the mythology, the trope of the absent father, God the Father, all of it. And in this book, my major the one poem that's really devoted to my father is called Pop Song, and it tells about his objectivity, the father's objectivity, the dead father's objectivity toward the living daughter. And his objectivity comes forth in like, hey, yeah, Di, nice to see you. But the connection is gone. And what is it? I need to explore that possibility at this point in my life.
Yeah, Di, I was at your reading when you launched the book with the other Jane. And
It's all Jane launchings.
yes. And that poem, that pop song poem, made me cry during the reading when you read it.
Mhm.
And it was reminding me of a class that I took in college that was about how it's, if you write in a more impersonal way, it could actually make the reader feel more.
Mhm.
And when you read that, I was really thinking of that, because there is this distancing in that poem, but yet it's one of the most moving poems in the whole collection, I think. And so I'm interested to hear you talk about that one that you didn't read today, because it is also a little bit of a longer one. But I'm wondering if you think a lot about that, the way that writing in a more impersonal way can actually trigger more emotion in the reader, and if that has any interplay for you in your writing.
Yeah, because you're not pushing the readers into something. You're opening a space, I hope, for the reader to feel, and to really feel the consequences of death, the consequence of distance. And in Jane's work, I mean, Jane, love it if you'd speak to this, but when I hear your work or read your work, it almost plays me like an instrument. It bypasses my intellect, my thinking brain, and it goes right to the body. But maybe you could talk about that.
Sure, yeah. I'm glad to hear that, because I do think that there's something specific about language as sound that does go straight to the bone.
Mhm.
And I'm very interested in embodiedness, particularly in poems where I write about my my own struggles with chronic illness. I have really bad asthma, which you might discern from the poems. So, you know, that the embodiedness of the work, I hope, does come through in that sonnet quality. You know, I'm also really interested in the idea of repetition and chiasmus and rhyme as a form of repetition as deeply embodied tools.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so much of my lived experience has been about repetition. And right now I'm really fascinated in the idea of the cough as a form of repetition. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so, you know,
We like to call it hacking.
that's right. Yes.
Hacking,
The
yeah.
methodology of hacking. Yeah. That'll be what my dissertation is called.
Yes,
Um,
yeah.
but yeah, I'm really interested in that, the way that a poem can bypass sense making.
Mm-hmm.
Someone in the chat, there's some great work happening in the chat. You mentioned language poetry, which has been an enormous influence on me.
Mm-hmm.
The materiality of language and the sonnet quality of language taking priority at times,
Mm-hmm.
as a means of creating something effective and something emotional and something true. So yeah, I'm grateful to hear that it works on you, Di.
Mm-hmm. Because if something better, you
That's
know.
right.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, it always has in your work. And I think especially when I was working with you as a student, I saw you decide to make this leap out of the sort of conventional narrative and realize that you could be free from that.
Yes.
And then you took off. That was your moment.
It took a long time to get there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's been fundamental to my education as a poet. I mean, I don't think I really arrived at the mode I'm currently working in until, you know, well after I finished my master's degree and, you know, all that stuff where you're supposed to learn all the things, you know. It was more so, you know, synthesizing all the things I was supposed to do and then deciding to do this other thing instead.
Mm-hmm.
Writing a lot of sestinas, I think also opened that up for me. The absolute power of repetition and modulation, even within a single word. Yeah.
You know, you mentioned in your reading addiction, in the speaker's family. Let's say the speaker, shall we?
Oh,
Um,
shoot.
and as you know, my speaker has contended with that as well. But also illness, you know, and of which addiction is one in the family. Um, and I'm thinking about, well, when I was a kid, like just sing-songiness and reading nursery rhymes and thinking rhymes in my head really was a great help. But those those things we do, I mean, like one of my little tricks was if I can get to the end of the hallway before I count to 10, my dad won't die, or that kind of logic. So it gets OCD-ish too, you know. And I wondered, you know, how much is your obsession with repetition and rhyme and meter part of your survival? You know, we all turn our survival mechanisms into an aesthetic. I mean, maybe that's how we decide upon how we sound as writers. So yeah.
I love that. Yeah, I think we turn our survival mechanisms into aesthetic. We aestheticize our bodies. We aestheticize our despairs and our disorders. And
Mm-hmm.
one of those things for me is OCD. And you know, someone in the chat also mentioned the idea of ritual,
Mm-hmm.
which I've long, you know, struggled with those same kind of magical thinking, compulsive intrusive thoughts. And so, You know, what happens if you take your, you know, like I had this thing for years where if I heard a number spoken out loud, like 17, I had to say in my head every other number between 1 and 100, or
Oh
something
God.
terrible would happen. So
Yeah.
it's that like obsessive filling, that obsessive completion. Um,
Hmm.
and I'm like, what if I turn that into poetry?
Yes.
And if I, you know, if you're doing, so if you're taking those repetitive actions 20, 30, 40 times a day, you're going to start thinking repetitively. So, you know, I'm so glad to have that question because it's so part of my process. And
Hmm.
it emerged organically just out of my own like neurological makeup. Yeah, Di, I'm interested in what you said before about how this closeness and distance comes through in the figuring it out on the page,
Hmm.
like Keats does in your amazing poem. You know, there and I know that we both share this interest in bringing in other poets into our work,
Yes.
and using an almost critical voice, right? Like, and I say critical, I
Hmm.
mean like the voice of criticism, uh,
Hmm.
but personalizing it as well. And then I'm wondering if you can chat a little bit about that in modern poetry and how you arrived there.
Yeah. You know, when I read some of the poems that are really teetering, I mean, Frank was, you know, what is a sonnet but a little song, right? That's what it means. So it was that teetering, well, in many cases between um, poem and song and poem and story. And then, you know, what I always want to do next is what isn't that, right? But it's also what I needed, and that is what is not little and not song. And that is a poem that can rhetorically work out an idea that I'm really struggling with. And can you do that and it still be a poem? And it and it's in some cases like there's one called poetry and one called against poetry, that, you know, if you took out the line breaks, it could pretty much look like an essay. And yet, as you say, there's an intimacy with the reader, with between the reader and the speaker that's different from an essay, although there's lyric essays. So, um, but yeah, and that critical, having access to the critical voice, the critical objective mind was really a salvation in the struggles that I was having with poetry, as a result of what is going on in the world, in the climate, in politics, etc., in my own life. So having access to the critical, you know, it's something that as a young poet I would have been completely intimidated by. I can't write that way. What the fuck do I know? You know? And anyway, why should I? You know, it's poetry. Um, but now it's such a saving grace to feel like I have a right. I have, you know, I used this word authority the other night when I read with Jane Hilberry. She talked about modern poetry kind of moving the center of contemporary poetry to a new place, and to feel that you have the authority to move the center, as bell hooks writes about. Well, and so, a man wrote me an email and said he didn't like the word authority. um, but and maybe it's an audacious thing to claim a kind of authority. I'm not claiming it for anybody but myself, but to feel at least I have the right to work it all out in front of you. And that, even if what I'm working out is idea or an intellectual proposition, it's a very vulnerable thing. And I don't think I would have had the guts, the confidence as a younger poet to put my toe into that water. You do a lot of speaking back to other writers and poetry as criticism. What is that for you? I mean, you're in a PhD program, girl. You know, you have the chops to do it. So talk to me about it.
Sure. Yeah, I love the word authority. I think, and I see in your poetry in this new book, not so much these statements of authority, but wrestling with what it means to know,
Mm-hmm.
and wrestling what it means and what it looks like and feels like to think about something. And that to me is where that kind of overused term of auto theory or auto criticism comes to mind, where you can oscillate rapidly between the lyric and the critical mode.
Mm-hmm.
Here in 2024, we're at a moment where I think that's possible.
Mm-hmm.
I hope it is, and your book teaches me that it is.
Good.
Yeah, and I think I didn't read, I should have probably, but I didn't read any of the poems that speak directly back to another poet or writer. But I'm really interested in how profoundly my life has been shaped by my reading and how much my writing has been shaped by it. And so it almost feels inevitable
Mm-hmm.
that would make it into the work. Everything I know about writing, comes from the outside.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea of influence is very important to me. And the word influence having so many connotations, that does come up in my book a lot. But I'm really interested in personalizing the critical. And modern poetry is, I think, a masterclass in that. And I'll continue to learn from it. Because there's just so much to be gleaned from an individual's interpretive powers. Interpretation is life. And so I'm interested in how people interpret and integrate and embody idea.
And it strikes me that interpretation can be sifted through many ways of being or ways of seeing. I mean, so much depends upon a red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater. And for me, a lot of times interpretation is the sieve of interpretation is the landscape, because that's what I had, that's what I was raised within. So interpretation, critical interpretation, doesn't necessarily mean only intellectual
Exactly.
colanders. It can mean all kinds of things. Yeah.
And I love the idea of the body as that sieve.
Yes.
Which I of course occurs in modern poetry as well. To kiss the lips of the dead poet, it becomes both an intellectual and a fully embodied mode of interpretation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
In the Keats poem that I read, really, it's not just about making out with dead Keats, but although that's there.
Let's be
But
honest.
let's own it. But about getting so close to a writer's work, to their ghost, that you almost inhabit them. He asked for that when he wrote "This living hand, now
Yeah.
warm and capable of earnest grasping," when he was asking the reader to bring him back to life through their attention.
Yes.
And at the end of Frank, I had the same request. Who will say of me, I kissed her, right? So it's both a deeply primal emotional instinct or impulse and an intellectual one.
Yes,
They're not separate.
or not. No. I think that speaking of moving the center, to me, that's what's most exciting about poetry and about criticism right now.
Can you say more?
Oh, just that idea that there's the veil is very thin between mind and body. And the idea that like critical interpretation can be physical and embodied,
Mhm.
and respiratory, you know.
You hope.
I,
If you can breathe that day. Mhm.
exactly. Yeah. Right. Doesn't
Mhm.
it make all the difference if you can breathe that day?
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it does.
And if you can't, that's a whole other gig. Mhm.
Yeah, right.
Mhm. So where's your work going next?
Oh, yeah, I'm working on a second manuscript, that's all poems in 2 stanzas.
Mm.
I'm exploring verticality, like the relationship one stanza has with a second stanza. Many of the second stanzas are in parentheses, like
Mm.
they act as an actual like gesture of asideness or I don't know. I guess that relationship remains elusive, and I think that it can be so many different things. So I think that actually came out of the High Bun project.
Mhm.
Is this form that offers you these 2 distinctive modes, and I'm like, huh, that's really interesting. How can that be enacted, in other forms? So I'm really interested in that. Yeah, Amy in the chat says a sub poem. That's exactly right.
Said
um
what?
Sub poem.
Mm. Mhm.
Yeah, that there's some kind of relationship from top and bottom. And so right now my poems are emerging in that form. Content wise, they're all over the map, but there is a lot of critical stuff happening, a lot of work that responds directly to other poets. Um, and I think that
Who?
kind of call and response form is really great. Did you say who? Oh geez. Sir Thomas Wyatt at the moment. Um, there's a huge gamut of of poets I'm responding to. Um, but I'm really just like pulling from, I'm actually responding to a lot of prose as well. I've been reading all this philosophy. I've had to read like Kant and Hegel and, all the old farts. And so I'm pulling from a lot of like philosophical texts these days too. So it's really all over the map.
Mhm.
But it's been really fun to explore like, that call and response form of like the 2 units has been really conducive to literally responding to other
Mm.
works of art. Yeah, and there's a lot of ekphrastic stuff going on too. Like I'm responding to a lot of visual art. It feels very dialectical, as they say.
Mhm.
Yeah, so that's kind of where I'm at.
That's very exciting. Thank you so much for this discussion so far. It's been amazing. I have a question, if that's okay. It's something that you both have hinted at during this conversation is like the pattern in your writing of like a new form, informal experimentation being what enables you to open up to new content, new things that maybe you previously felt you couldn't write about or weren't even thinking to write about. And I'm wondering if you could talk to us a little bit more about what that's been like for you, and if you have any specific examples that you remember or anything like that.
Well, I'll say right out of the gate that when I was in college and studying with Di, she taught me that there's really no such thing as writer's block or inspiration, that you
Mhm.
really just need to either read someone new or try a new form. And that advice has stuck with me, all these many years later. And I
I'm
think
glad something did, Jane.
it really has. I mean, I think that like the way that you taught your classes were so form-based because form is so generative.
Mhm.
And I've carried that with me forever and continue and will continue to. I think we have to continually be inventing and innovating.
Mhm.
And your books teach us that.
Thank you. Yeah, in this book, I mean, I sort of set in front of myself the challenge after Frank of free verse, longer poems, but I also have several ballads in the book. And the ballad form worked perfectly because I'm also titling a lot of poems after kinds of song, um, musical forms and types. And so the ballad, which is, song form, and with its circularity, it's narrative circularity, so one step forward, two steps back, sort of like a pantoum. Um, it it fit the discursiveness of thought that I was needing in this book. Um, so yeah, so um, when you commit yourself to exploring a form like the sonnet, like a ballad, like the sestina, you're not just committing to, oh God, I have to come up with end words, but although there's that, but to a certain mode, not just of thinking, but of being, you know, a ballad. The first ballad in the book is about when my mother came and picked me up from school to tell me that my father was dead. And it really became a poem, I think, because I pictured like a little flute or something in the background, pan, um, about a girl practicing her innocence. The little girl in it is a little bit of a trickster because she knows, but she wants to make her mom tell. And she pretends not to know death, you know? And I was interested in that weird pan-like circularity of thought. And then by the very end, it sort of drives toward actually picking apart his casket and his bones and seeing this crooked tooth he had that's crooked like mine. That moment of innocence, of intimate connection that kind of that is also very austere, so I don't think you get to that through thinking. You get to that through following the lead of a form, that directs your thinking, that directs your feeling in a certain pattern. Does that make sense? It might have sounded like mud.
I think it makes sense.
Okay.
Made sense as well. Thank you.
Yeah.
It's so interesting how form can take us somewhere we weren't expecting to go,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
or like shape a thought
Mm-hmm.
in a way we couldn't otherwise. That's what the Sistina did for me. Yeah.
Well, and in your book, you have like so-called failed forms, or
Right.
disintegrating forms.
Yes.
Do you want to say something about that?
Sure. And it really reminds me, Di, of your many brilliant writings and tweets and
Oh God.
about the sonnet.
Yeah.
Like the recent conversation on Twitter about sonnetness and the vestiges of a form existing, even if the form doesn't fully exist.
Mm-hmm.
And so I love the idea. I love failure and writing about failure. The book in many ways is about failing and rejecting perfection. Um, And so I love the idea of taking a form and letting it exist in ruins,
Mhm.
but still maintaining, yeah, certain relics from that form, which I think that Frank does so masterfully, that, you know, in each poem, you can see traces of sonnetness. Really, I think explicit traces of sonnetness,
Mhm.
you know, even though we're not working in a metrical schema. Um,
Mhm.
and, you know, I think that that's always an option, you know, to take a form and to manipulate it.
Mhm.
Um, and
You
so
know,
like,
ruins are beautiful.
exactly,
Mhm.
right. And when, especially if your content is kind of right there too, at the brink of ruin,
Mhm.
at the brink of ruination, at the brink of despair, at the brink, you know, there's this edginess there. And I mean
Mhm.
that literally, like a standing on the edge. Um, and so there's something great, like the failed Sestina in the book started out as a trial at a real Sestina. And as it kind of disintegrated, as Sestinas do, they don't sustain themselves well. I was like,
Mhm.
huh, that lack of sustaining itself is really interesting.
Mhm.
Let's let it be on the page, and let's make it excessively wrong.
Yeah,
And so
exactly.
call it it's a poem about having crippling anxiety. And so, you know, to me, that the form and the content both came alive in not being able to write a sestina. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a poem in modern poetry called Villanelle, and it's not a villanelle.
Right.
It's
Yeah.
about reading iffy villanelle in front of a crowd and showing my garbage, showing my incapacity, you know. So yeah, isn't that interesting?
Yes. Yeah.
We're twins, girl. We're twins.
I think we both share that interest, and you know, coming out of coming out of your classroom, you know, I have I owe you that in a lot of ways. Like you showed me at the very beginning the potential of form, and that was everything to me. Um, you know, I'm excited about like continuing to innovate with form, as I know you
Mhm.
are too.
Well, you are, as a younger poet, reinvigorating formal poetry. And thank God, you know, I mean, because that's our lifeblood.
Yes.
It's our this living hand now warm and capable of earnest grasping, you know. Without that, it dies, I'm afraid, you know.
I'm trying to pass that down to my students too, that love for form. It
Mhm.
feels like this kind of school of thought, for lack of a better phrase, that needs to be continuously reinvented. You know, and so now I teach undergraduates and I always start with form. Um, yeah, not static form. No, there's someone in the chat that I'm just replying to. No, form is not static.
I'm seeing that too.
Yeah.
No, it's anything. I mean, the person on Twitter, if you saw it or didn't, who was so angry at me, I think it was because I messed with the sonnet. That the sonnet is this thing and you're messing with it. And I understand that. I get it. But so, I mean, are we going to be writing Shakespearean sonnets still now? I mean, I think it's good to try them and to write them, but what else can it be? How do we keep it alive? And I think she saw that as a betrayal of the form, you know. Uh,
I think all forms are betrayals, though.
yeah. I
They
mean,
come from
Shakespeare
somewhere.
was betraying,
Exactly.
you
It's all
know.
about metrical substitution in Shakespeare.
Mhm.
Like, you know, and even when the sonnet first emerged on the scene, it's kind of a betrayal of previous poetic and linguistic forms,
Mhm.
which is then a betrayal of other poetic and linguistic forms. Like language and form is constantly evolving, for various reasons, and out of various like creative groups and individuals. And so to say that things can't change is to, I think, deny the entire history of poetry.
Mm-hmm.
And of language itself, because
Right.
language is a betrayal of the experience. And so what this person is is really saying is, everything is a betrayal if she's claiming that. Another thing that the two of you write a lot about in such an interesting way is the act is writing poetry. You write a lot about the act of writing. And I thought that it's interesting that it's a risky thing to do, but in your hands, it never seems cloying or contrived. And I was wondering if part of what that is because you're so willing to talk about the failures of it on the page, or you let the reader share in your discovery process. But I'm wondering if there are other things that you think come into play craft-wise that make writing about poetry so successful in some of these poems.
Well, it's our work, you write about your life, and if that's your life, then there it is, you're writing about it. For me, I think part of it is just being really honest about my own perspective and my own foibles, my own mistakes. I mean, at the end of that poem, called Comma, the sort of person speaking to me off stage is like, what are you going to do with the ashes? What are you going to, where are you going to put them? What are you going to play music wise? A magic bus, um, and then says, don't narrativize Diane. Don't narrativize Diane. See what a comma can do. So there's this, I'm kind of playing the dumb guy in the poem more often than not, and letting the ghosts teach me something, So I think it's important to, we've been talking about authority, but at the same time, there's humility and the willingness to show the seams, like Jane does with her failed forms, For me, it comes through in a character almost, or a personality on the page. But Jane,
Back to you.
back to you, Jane, on the street.
Yeah, great question. I'm interested in this mystery that is poetry. I think that the form remains mysterious to me. The genre remains mysterious to me. So when I write about writing, which I do often, there is a reckoning with something maybe a little, I don't know, spectral, or elliptical, or even spiritual, where I don't feel like I have a grasp on it. It feels like it's always slipping through my hands. I have a poem where I describe the inception moment of a poem as plucking a sequin off the sleeve of time, or something, some nonsense like that. But I like the idea that, like, I don't know, there's this thing out there that can be grasped if you sit down and try it. And to me, it's always been forever mysterious to me, like why I'm so incredibly drawn to writing in this medium. And so, yeah, I think when I write about it, I try to keep that humility that Di described. There's really no way to become an expert at one's own craft. And it's at that nexus of knowing but not knowing that I like to place my poetry poems. Yeah, that creative impulse, like what is that? You know, speaking of philosophers, like we've been trying to figure that out for a long time, what it means to make something. So I like to sit with that in my work.
To sit with it rather than solve it.
Absolutely.
Mhm. Yeah, and that's what our friend Keats meant by negative capability, the ability to stand the unanswerable, you know.
Absolutely. Yeah. That negative capability thing is I know important to both of us too.
Mm-hmm.
You know, despite
And you know, he just dropped it into a letter to
I
his
know,
brothers. It was like no biggie.
I know, and here we
Biggie.
are, you know, still like trying to understand it. Um, but it betrays understanding, you know, and I think poetry does too. So it feels very it feels important to me to write about the art of poem making because it is my world.
Mm-hmm.
It's how I interpret things and how I come to understand my own mind. And so, you know, again, it feels inevitable.
Mm-hmm. Our, I know we're right at the end. Is there, Jennifer, is there a remaining question or?
Well, Sophia and I always love to ask all the poets who come to speak a little bit about your advice about putting together a collection, because we
Mhm.
have a lot of students and a lot of them are older students who have already had other careers and they have always wanted to publish a book, and they are making time in their lives now to do that, to fulfill that dream. And so thinking of that demographic in mind, if you could just speak a little bit about advice that you might have for people putting together a first poetry collection.
That's
Sure.
that's cool. That's exciting. Hmm.
Yeah, it's, you know, you should do it. That's, I guess, the first thing. But know that it requires a lot of patience and persistence. It took me more than 5 years to get this book out into the world, and it took on many manifestations, which Di knows very well. um, Having looked at many of them generously. So yeah, I think patience and also to have trust in your work, even as you evolve away from that work. Like, you know, I wrote a lot of these, not a lot of them, but a handful of these poems are from many, many years ago. And I feel like I've evolved, moved past them, whether I've evolved, I'm not sure, but I've moved past them. And so sometimes to look at these poems, I feel like I'm looking into the past, like engaging with the past self. And I have to just trust. I have to trust in that work, you know, even though it spans a long period of time. And so I've heard that from a lot of poets, like, oh, by the time my book finally comes out, I'm kind of over it. Um, I think that's really not really natural. And it's also like, yeah, to maintain a kind of trust in your former self. Um, so patience, both like logistically, it takes a hell of a long time to submit, to finally get it picked up, etc. But also just patience with your work, and trust in your work. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we're from Michigan and there's a certain working class aroma around making a book, which that word persistence is part of, I think. What can I add? One thing I think we've both talked about today in one way or the other is, you know, having it's interesting because yes, you're drawing on poets of the past, you're responding to the world, um, but you also have to remain a little hermetic. Um, that is, don't get too influenced by, you know, your writing group, your social media group, your, you know, there's it's easy to kind of get diluted. Your weirdness can get diluted, and I mean good weirdness, by following too many voices competing for your, for an interpretation of your work that makes them feel they can tell you what to do. What's interesting about you is the particular process, the particular quirks that were born with you and that were formed by your situation of origin and the landscape you were raised with and all of that stuff. That's what's interesting. So don't feel like you have to write or do it like anybody else. Get a couple of good readers who you trust, and at some point get their input. But every contemporary poetry book, there's so much, they're not instruction manuals for you. They're only what somebody else did. So even what Jane did and what I did, they're not instruction manuals beyond follow the brush, follow your own freaky instincts. Be what life made you and make poems in that image. I liked what Jane said about the book is sort of an artifact of a process, and I remember a professor saying to me, I was like 19, Di, you're in the danger of becoming an artifact, poems are artifacts of a process, and so yeah, expect to feel, that's what Keats was talking about with that Grecian urn, I mean, they are artifacts you work upon. That's part of the objectivity they give you, because they're these urns that you're painting upon, breaking the handle off of, or whatever. They aren't you, and so you can still believe in them, even if they're artifacts of a process, that is in the past now.
I think that is such good advice given the current publishing landscape, because it does just take so much time. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's beautiful. I'm seeing so many people in the chat that, it's okay to be a weirdo. Yes, it's essential to be a weirdo. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just think of what Jane said about what drives her aesthetic.
About that.
Just think of that for once. Goddamn life. So, I mean,
we
yeah.
all have that capacity in us. Yeah, and that individual subjectivity, like I said, is what makes your work your work. Yeah, and what makes it original and not just, imitative or yeah.
Because there's so much, and what I'm reading for many like prizes and stuff, whatever. And I really, I go through a period of cynicism, like there's crates worth of poetry, my whole house, you should see it. But then I go through this period where I'm like, God, there's so much good shit. There's so much good stuff and real stuff and unusual stuff. That isn't a problem. That's a good thing. That there's so much. And we're all doing it. We're all doing it together.
Well, yeah, maybe that's my last line of advice is to read really widely. Especially, if you're putting together a manuscript, see what's out there. I mean, see what other people are doing. Don't use that as, an instruction manual, but yeah, I think it can be really inspiring just to see like what other poets are doing on the page and to kind of keep a finger on the pulse and follow the poets you love religiously. And yeah, it's it's inspiring.
Yeah, and instead of being like, oh, I have to push ahead of the crowd, you know, it's look what all these humans are expressing and creating, and I get to be part of that, small part of it, but part of it. And it's, let that hold you up along with forms.
It's
I
such a
caught I caught Jane's asthma.
through the tube. I think that it's such an optimistic way of framing a process that can sometimes feel really dejecting and difficult. Yeah, so I'll hold on to that, and I appreciate you saying that, Di. Yeah.
Well,
Thank you.
I want to thank all of you today, the audience, the always incredible Hudson Valley Writer Center audience for their engagement and questions in the chat. Sophia, as always, asking the best questions. Di and Jane for their readings and conversation. I'm really glad you allowed us to record this so people can go back and listen, especially the people who didn't get the time change in other countries.
Oh,
They
yes.
came in late, and so we have the whole recording. And I just want to say the beauty of mentorship here between the two of you, and then what came out of that mentorship and became a poetic friendship and mutual respect. And I think that you embody what you're saying about individual voice. You were saying Di opened the door for you with form, but then you took it in a completely different way. These are not two poets who write like each other. These are two very different voices, but who complement each other in such a beautiful way. And it was so interesting to hear the two of you speak about your process, your craft, what poetry means to you. And you can tell the passion and vitality that you bring to your work in your conversation on the page, with your attention to each other's work and to your own work. And I really want to thank you for sharing it with us today. It means so much.
Mm. Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you so much. And
You're the most human.
agreed. And
Mhm.
thank you so much, Di, for inviting me to join you today.
Oh my God, thanks for doing it. My God. Can you imagine if I was just dangling out here alone? How hideous. How
That's really a
hideous.
treat. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, we've gone, the first time I had Jane in class, the first day she walked in, I came in with all my shit and I looked at her and I didn't know her. And she was looking at me with this like, like, come on, this expectant, like wide awake eyes and like, let's do this. It was just so funny. And that's what we did. But quickly, it stopped being, I didn't have that much to teach her. Really, it was the door. And now I learn from her. So it's cool. Thank you, Jane.
Thank
Thank
you
you, listeners. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Sophia.
all so much for being here. This was fantastic.
Hmm.
And I will save the chat and send it to you, Jane and Di, so you can see everything you didn't get a chance to look at, and you can feel all the love from everybody. We really appreciate you having the time today to be with us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Hmm.
Bye, everyone. Thank you for
Bye.
being here. Thank you, Sophia.